456, it was clear that it was time to get out of Rome while the getting was good. Better to head back to Gaul, where the climate was better. But he would never get off the peninsula. Ricimer had demonstrated his military talents throughout the summer by besting the Vandals in skirmish after skirmish, eventually forcing Genseric to recall his men and take stock of his sudden change in fortune. The year before, the Vandal king had stood on the Capitoline Hill deciding whether or not to burn Rome to the ground, and now his men couldn't even raid the coast of Sicily without getting tripped up. Ricimer was clearly a man who knew what he was doing. Riding high on these victories, the Germanic general returned to the mainland and began plotting with Majorian to dispense with their rival for power. The critical mistake Avitus made, and the catalyst that triggered Majorian and Ricimer to act, was his decision to send his Gothic allies on ahead of him. As I just noted, they had become a political liability, and so he ordered them back to Gaul, even though their presence was the main reason he wasn't being directly attacked. But Avitus misjudged the situation, and thought that sending the Goths off would ease tensions rather than flare them up. But flare them up it did. With Avitus now essentially alone in Italy, Ricimer and Majorian pounced. The Italian legions moved on Avitus as the emperor neared Ravenna. Avitus closed ranks in the capital city with the forces he had left, and may have been able to hold out for reinforcements from Gaul. But unfortunately, the terms of securing Gothic loyalty now came back to bite him. In exchange for supporting his claim to power, Avitus had offered Theodoric the opportunity to expand Goth dominion into Spain. Theodoric had immediately invaded the Iberian Peninsula and tried to take it over. So when the desperate call came in from Avitus for Theodoric to come down to Italy and help him defeat Ricimer and Majorian, the Goths were bogged down fighting in Spain, and Avitus was on his own. The now floundering emperor faced his adversaries near the city of Piacenza, but it was hopeless from the start. Ricimer and Majorian's forces overwhelmed him, and Avitus fled into the city. In October of 456, Avitus was officially deposed by Majorian and placed under house arrest. In an interesting twist, the deposed emperor was not immediately executed, as you would have expected given the circumstances. Instead, he was forced to renounce his titles and property and agree to become the bishop of Piacenza, a curious form of punishment, but one that removed Avitus from the political picture. He was about 60 years old and had ruled the empire for 15 months. It isn't entirely clear why Ricimer and Majorian decided to leave Avitus alive, but it may have had something to do with currying favor with the Eastern Emperor Marcian, who, though he had never supported Avitus, may not have been impressed by his cold-blooded execution either. The reason I say this is because Marcian continued to play coy with the would-be emperors of the West, even after the fall of Avitus, and so during the winter of 456-57, Avitus lived. But in January of 457, Marcian died, and shortly thereafter, Avitus was killed. Marcian, by the way, of the East for 7 years. His passing marks the official end of the Theodosian dynasty and the extended Valentinian Theodosian dynasty that had ruled the East for almost 100 years. Marcian's passing appears to have marked the end of leniency for Avitus, because shortly after the Eastern Augustus died, the deposed Western Augustus was either strangled or starved at Majorian's order, which is why I personally suspect that negotiations with Constantinople had some kind of impact on Avitus's curious fate, because otherwise, why keep him alive just to kill him? But there is another possible explanation. Just as Avitus didn't have the support of the Italians, Majorian and Ricimer didn't really have the support of the Gauls. By keeping Avitus alive, they may have been hoping to prevent a Gallic uprising. But our sources hint that an uprising in Gaul started up anyway, as most of the nobility, and certainly the Goths, continued to recognize Avitus as the legitimate emperor. So, rather than allow a rallying point to live, Majorian had Avitus killed in early 457. But now the situation was really muddled. Marcian was dead, so there was no emperor in the east. Avitus was deposed and then killed, and Majorian not yet elevated, so there's no emperor in the west. So who was running the show? The answer, of course, was the barbarian generals that good and proper Romans refused to let rule in their own right. In the west, that meant Ricimer, who was trying to rule the west in his own right with a commission granted by Constantinople, but who would settle for making Majorian a puppet emperor. In the east, we are still talking about Aspar, the ethnic Alan who had helped settle the Vandal question back in the 430s, and who had remained a powerful force in Constantinople ever since. When Marcian died in late January 457, the Eastern Court debated for 11 days who would succeed him. At first, it appeared that Marcian's son-in-law, Anthemius, grandson of the Praetorian prefect Anthemius, who had built the Theodosian walls, would get the nod. But Aspar stepped in and pushed for a Thracian general named Leo. Aspar finally got his way, and on February the 7th, 457, Leo was crowned Emperor Leo I. The new emperor was supposed to be a weak-willed puppet who Aspar could control, but it quickly became apparent that Leo had a will of his own. But the elevation of Leo had little immediate impact on the question of who controlled the West. Next week, though, Ricimer and Majorian will sort it out for themselves. Tired of waiting for Constantinople to nominate someone, anyone to rule, Ricimer will resign himself to the fact that he will not be able to rule the West in his own right, and instead he will push Majorian to become Augustus. By sheer coincidence, it was on April the 1st, 457 AD, exactly 1555 years ago, that Majorian became emperor of the Western Empire. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 100,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 30-day trial membership. There's no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to stick with the basics and re-recommend another classic, Plutarch's Lives. This is the really good stuff, the foundational stuff, the stuff you absolutely need to read, listen to, whatever. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, episode 175, Trying to Take It All Back. Following the defeat, deposition, and execution of Avitus, the Western Empire was once again left without an officially recognized ruler. At least, that's how the leaders of the West looked at it. According to Constantinople, the western half of the empire had been without a ruler since the assassination of Valentinian III almost 2 years before. The Eastern Augustus Marcian had never recognized Petronius Maximus or Eparchius Avitus, and it didn't look like he had any interest in recognizing the new would-be Emperor Majorian either. The general Ricimer tried to exploit this unwillingness on the part of the East to legitimize the emperors of the West by attempting to secure a sort of viceroy commission for himself, to personally rule the western provinces, but in the name of Constantinople. But then Marcian died, and Leo the Thracian became emperor of the East, and he didn't appear keen to recognize Majorian as emperor or let Ricimer rule as a viceroy. Which was no doubt a little frustrating for them, especially since Leo had no more claim to power than they did. Marcian at least had the lingering legitimacy of having married into the imperial Theodosian family. Leo was just some general. By the spring of 457, Ricimer finally gave up on the idea of becoming viceroy, and knowing that the Italian nobility would never accept him as emperor because of his German heritage, he backed his protege Majorian for the job. In a ceremony in Ravenna on April the 1st, Majorian was crowned with the diadem and took over official control of the West. But though the diadem sat on Majorian's head, it was clear that he was really co-ruling with Ricimer. Leo and the court of Constantinople did not immediately recognize Majorian, but really at this point, who cared what they said? It's not like Majorian was so offensive to the East that they were going to raise an army to throw him out of power, so you guys do what you want, we'll be over here running the West. But the West was now a pale shadow of its former self. Britain was gone. North Africa was gone. Most of Gaul was split between barbarian factions, and Spain was now slowly but surely being conquered by the Goths, and you can be sure that the Goths had no interest in letting Majorian tell them what to do. So when the two generals seized power, they were basically seizing control of Italy, and only Italy. Everything else was out of their control. The Romans had not been so geographically circumscribed since the days just before the Punic Wars, some 700 years earlier. But Majorian and Ricimer were ambitious men and vigorous soldiers. They were not going to be content with sitting around Ravenna, running out the clock, governing the Italian peninsula. No, they were going to push back against the tide of history. They wanted it all back. Gaul, Spain, North Africa, hell, even Britain if they could swing it. In the minds of Ricimer and Majorian, their rise to power was going to be a turning point in history, the moment when the Western Empire returned to glory. But though, as we're about to see, they made a pretty good run at it, in the end the tide of history was too great to overcome. That and the petty jealousies that so often ruin good work just as it's getting started. Majorian and Ricimer spent the rest of 457 consolidating their hold over Italy. There appears to have been some sort of attempt by the Alemanni to take advantage of the chaos by possibly raiding over the Alps, or at least getting ready to raid over the Alps, because right off the bat, Majorian is credited with winning some sort of victory against the Germans. For the next year and a half, the new regime focused its attention primarily on questions of Italian security, but they also began to make legislative claims on Gaul. When it came to Italy, the biggest threat was obviously posed by the Vandals. Though Ricimer had beaten them back in 456,